If you followed the videos to thus far, you'll know that we have once-off binding, one-way binding, two-way binding, and we've got some examples over here where we have an input which is a two-way binding because it's an input and it has a value property that we want to set, but it also has a change event that we can listen to. This div sets the inner text, but it doesn't have a change event, so data can actually only flow in one direction, that is from the binding context to the HTML. There's no way for you to change the div in runtime to flow that data back. So one-way binding is the only thing that makes sense here. But to remember to write two-way and one-way, and when it is two-way and when it is one-way, can be a bit bothersome. So one of the shorthands that you can use is just to use the word .bind instead of one-way or two-way. Now note that this doesn't count for once-off binding, because once-off binding is a very explicit event where one-way and two-way binding is like still a runtime consideration. So what the binding engine does here is it has a look at and sees, oh, well, this is an input. Okay, well, I know an input requires a two-way binding, and it makes this a two-way binding on your behalf. And similarly, in this case, it sees, oh, okay, well, this isn't actually something that has a change event. So I'm just going to make this a one-way binding on your behalf. So let's go and have a look at the HTML quickly. So here's our screen, and we've changed all of our expressions now. So we'll put in John and Doe, and we can see that it still works. Note that the Doe doesn't show here because our binding actually doesn't express that. So if I wanted to use a scenario where I use both, I wouldn't use the bind on the inner text in any way. I would just put it in the middle as per normal. So note that this is also a one-way binding. Why? Because you can't change it. The data can only flow in one direction, which is the binding context to the HTML. Having made those changes now, we can refresh and put in, and now we can see that both of those values are being pulled through. Right, so summary, instead of using one-way or two-way, you can just use the word .bind and let the binding engine figure it out on your behalf.